BookTube, it's Amy. This afternoon I finally, and I say finally because I started reading this one back in May, I finally finished reading Will Darling's The Bankrupt Bookseller. And I talked about this book previously in a book haul and update video that I'd done. But I'm going to repeat myself on a few things, seeing as this video is directly about the Bankrupt Bookseller itself. So this is actually a volume containing two separate titles, two novels that were published separately about 8 years apart. So the first, 7 or 8 years apart rather. So the first is The Private Papers of a Bankrupt Bookseller, published in 1931, and the second is The Bankrupt Bookseller Speaks Again, published in 1938. And this is the collected volume, republished, both of the books, in 1947. And so I quite enjoyed reading through this. I think of it sort of as one novel, even though it's technically two. I will say reading through this novel, because it really is, the same characters, same subject matter, almost a repetition in some ways of itself. It deals with the same time frame, same perspective, and it is this, found diary. We have an introduction by the businessman next door to the bookshop in question here, and he is letting us know that when he, expanded his women's fashion shop into the shop space next door, he came across these diaries of this now deceased bookseller. And so The Private Papers, which is the first book, is the supposed publishing of selections from these papers. And the second book is a continuation, so a publishing of additional material. And both books, The Private Papers and, let me just recall, The Speaks Again, so both The Private Papers of a Bankrupt Bookseller and The Bankrupt Bookseller Speaks Again, both are the same time frame. And so both kind of end with the bookseller contemplating death, contemplating the end of his life, his desire no longer to live, and his sort of disenchantment with life in general, and with his bookselling business. And at first I thought that I preferred The Private Papers, but today when I came back to The Bankrupt Bookseller Speaks Again, the second part, I found that I enjoyed the last 40 or 50 pages very, very much. And I think in my mind it's kind of hard to separate them, because it really is kind of a continuation, a repetition in some ways. We have similar themes. So our bookseller, we get his whole story about how he came to own the bookshop, and then he dives into memories of serving in the First World War, memories of his time as an insurance salesman in his younger days, and then he kind of wallows in his sorrows over the poor business, his sorrows over the fact that nobody seems to want to buy the books that he stocks, his sorrows over the fact that people come in looking for books that he doesn't have and he's unable to make those sales, and then also in this odd way, kind of his sorrows over the books that he does sell. On a number of occasions, he laments that he has sold a book that he had not, finished reading yet himself, or that he had not memorized a particular poem from yet. In fact, there's one occasion where he sells an entire set of poetry, and kind of imagines himself going to the customer's hotel to ask for one particular volume back, so that he can memorize one particular poem. And so he's so absorbed in his books that perhaps he's not really that good of a businessman. In the 40 pages I read today, 60 or 40 pages, I forget how many, he does talk about making some attempts to be a profitable bookseller. He kind of rages against some of these cheaper editions earlier on in the books, but by the end he is in some way embracing pocket editions, Everyman Library editions, and trying to, make window displays to bring his customers in. He's constantly looking at the women's fashion shop next door and seeing how things change with the season and how their sales, and lamenting that he can't, have the skills or the same kind of business model that would allow him to make money in that way. But as I was finishing it up, I was thinking, what is it comparable to? Because I do really love nonfiction books about booksellers. It's sort of a favorite genre of mine to read essays on book collecting and book selling. And of course, there's been some wonderful books I've read, like The Confessions of a Bookseller by Sean Bythell. Bythell? I'm suddenly not remembering how to pronounce the last name of that Scottish author. But other books like 84 Charing Cross Road. And I think this is sort of a marrying of those two kind of genres. 84 Charing Cross Road is, of course, very much a narrative. It's set up in a little bit of a way like a novel, although it is, mainly letters there. The Confessions of a Bookseller is diary entries, and this is set up as journal entries, diary entries. They're not, labeled by days, but they're labeled by his writing sessions, these supposed writing sessions. And it really is a deep dive into what it was like to run a bookstore in the early 20th century, the 1920s and 30s. And a deep dive into literature and a love of books. He's constantly telling us about, his favorite authors, what customers are looking for. There's one scene that I read today where he was a little bit offended because a customer had come in looking for first editions of Robert Louis Stevenson. And unfortunately, he didn't have any because he's not really that kind of bookseller. He doesn't have, those rare expensive editions because, he himself can't afford to buy them. He's got kind of a lower end stock. But when he tells the customer he doesn't have these first editions, the customer accuses him of not knowing anything at all about Robert Louis Stevenson. And so he sets off into proving to this customer that he is knowledgeable. And he starts listing off all the works by Stevenson. Unfortunately, he misses one and feels, quite put out by this interaction with the customer. He talks about reading the works of Chesterton, how he preferred certain, novels, certain collections over others. He talks about the historical works of Churchill. He talks about new collections, well, not new collections, but republishing of Ruskin, and how Ruskin had so much to offer. And there was one line, I probably can't find it just by flipping through, but it was in the last little bit I read today, where he sort of repeats this idea that I've read elsewhere before and that I do very much agree with. He repeats this idea, this perfect quote from someone that he's read, noting that there is something of value in every old book there is to read. I think it might more specifically be phrased, the intelligent person, and I don't think that's the word that he uses, but the intelligent person can find something of value in every old book they pick up, regardless of the age. And of course, that idea I think it comes from Johnson. He kind of quotes it as coming from Samuel Johnson of, someone tells you how great a new release was. Someone tells you how great this new book is. And his response is to go home and read an old book. which is something I agree with, although I don't think we should, throw out all new books. I do enjoy, a new release now and then, but I am much more interested and much more at home reading the old books. And so that's sort of the flavor of these two novels republished in one, The Bankrupt Bookseller by Will Y. Darling. And so I think if you're a fan of books about books, novels about book selling, this might be one that you want to seek out. It is not being currently printed anywhere. It's not being republished. So if you would like to read it, you will have to go online and search out yourself an older edition from a used bookseller. But there are several floating around for sale online at the moment. So if you're really that interested, it shouldn't be too difficult to find one. As I said, you might find it in the 1947 printing or about that time, published as The Bankrupt Bookseller. If you find it published under this, you'll get both novels, or alternatively, you can buy them separately as The Private Papers of the Bankrupt Bookseller or The Bankrupt Bookseller Speaks Again. And so this was a fun one, something I think I'll definitely return to. It was more melancholy and sadder than I expected, but in a good way. Definitely in a good way. But I'll leave it at that for now, and I'll be back again soon to talk about more books.